Welcome to the WWC Advanced Group Design Training Module focused on sample attrition and baseline equivalence in regression discontinuity design, or RDD, studies. You can access all of the resources mentioned in this module through the WWC website, whatworks.ed.gov. This module describes the WWC's second RDD standard, or the Attrition and Baseline Equivalence Standard, which outlines requirements for RDDs to establish a low level of sample attrition or to instead establish the equivalence of the groups being compared at the cutoff value of the forcing variable. This module introduces the way the WWC assesses attrition and baseline equivalence in RDDs and how it can affect an RDD study's research rating. After completing this module, you will be able to define what is meant by assessing sample attrition and baseline equivalence in a regression discontinuity design, and you will be able to describe how to apply the standard when conducting a WWC review of an RDD study. Recall from the group design training that attrition refers to the loss of study units after allocation to research conditions. Attrition is important because it can change the composition of the groups and potentially affect the estimated impact of the intervention being tested in the study. An RDD study, therefore, must have acceptable levels of overall and differential attrition rates. Overall attrition is the percentage of assigned units for which the researchers do not observe outcome data, whereas differential attrition is the absolute value of the percentage point difference between attrition rates for the intervention and comparison groups. As described in greater detail in the group design training series, the WWC attrition standard is based on a model of attrition bias. That attrition model drew on data from several large education studies and considers different combinations of overall and differential attrition, estimating how much bias is expected for each combination. The WWC chose 0.05 standard deviations as the threshold for an acceptable or tolerable level of bias, and used these to create the attrition thresholds shown in the figure displayed here. The WWC's attrition boundaries identify combinations of overall and differential attrition that separate what the WWC defines as high or low attrition. The WWC uses this model to define two boundaries for attrition: an optimistic boundary and a cautious boundary. Before reviewing any studies, WWC review teams select the attrition boundary they will use, optimistic or cautious, and they document this decision in a topic area review protocol. The team members will use the same attrition boundary for all studies reviewed under the topic area review protocol, and for all outcomes within each study. The figure on this slide illustrates the difference between the optimistic and cautious boundaries. The vertical axis on the graph represents differential attrition, and the horizontal axis represents overall attrition. The green shaded area means low attrition, and red means high attrition. If the WWC reviews studies under a cautious attrition boundary, the yellow shaded area is taken to mean high attrition. However, if the WWC reviews studies under an optimistic boundary, the yellow shaded area means low or tolerable attrition. For more detailed information on the WWC's General Attrition Standard and attrition boundaries, see the Group Design Standards training modules. As shown in this table from the WWC Procedures and Standards Handbook, referred to in this module as the Handbook, for findings from an RDD study to completely satisfy RDD Standard 2. The reported combination of overall and differential attrition rates must be low when calculated using an approach identified as providing less accurate adjustment for the forcing variable, or the study findings must demonstrate baseline equivalence on key covariates. If an RDD study finding does not satisfy either of these two criteria, the study will not satisfy RDD Standard 2. We will now describe the criteria for this RDD Standard 2 in greater detail. For an RDD study to satisfy the attrition requirement, attrition rates must be low, and the samples used to calculate attrition must include all sample members who are eligible to be assigned to conditions using the forcing variable, and not just a subset of those participants known to the researcher. For example, if age is used to assign students to a pre-kindergarten program, the assignment mechanism typically applies to all students in a defined geographical region, such as a state or a district, and at a specified time, such as the fall of a certain school year. An RDD study that examines the impact of the pre-kindergarten program using age as the forcing variable could only demonstrate acceptable levels of attrition if it can identify the full set of students who were present in the geographical region at the specified time and were eligible to be assigned to the intervention or comparison group. A study calculating attrition only within an administrative data set on students enrolled in the state schools several years after assignment would not meet this requirement, because the intervention could have affected whether students remained in the state. In other words, attrition cannot be assessed in an RDD study unless all units who were eligible to be assigned to conditions are known, and the assigned condition for all of these units is known. However, it is important to note that attrition in RDDs can be assessed within exogenous subgroups, which the WWC defines as subgroups identified using a variable that is unrelated to intervention participation. For example, the authors might randomly sample from the full sample of eligible students to establish a smaller subgroup of eligible students, or attrition could be calculated within a bandwidth around the cutoff of the forcing variable. All of these would be examples of exogenous subgroups. Whatever the case, attrition must be assessed separately for each contrast of interest. Criterion A of the RDD Standard 2, which hereafter we will refer to as RDD Criterion 2A, requires that the reported combination of overall and differential attrition rates must be shown to be low using at least one of two approaches that have the potential to adjust for the forcing variable most accurately. The first approach that can be used to satisfy RDD Criterion 2A is if researchers report the predicted mean attrition rate at the cutoff, estimated using data from below the cutoff, and the predicted mean attrition rate at the cutoff, estimated using data from above the cutoff. Both numbers must be estimated using a statistical model that controls for the forcing variable using the same approach that was used to estimate the intervention impact on the outcome. More specifically, the impact on attrition must be estimated using exactly the same bandwidth and/or functional form that was used to estimate the impact on the outcome, or the impact on attrition must be estimated using the same algorithm for selecting the bandwidth, and/or functional form used to estimate the impact on the outcome. For the purposes of applying the attrition standard, the overall attrition rate is defined as the average of the predicted mean attrition rates on either side of the cutoff, and the differential attrition rate is defined as the difference in the predicted mean attrition rates on either side of the cutoff. The second approach that can be used to satisfy RDD Criterion 2A is if the researchers report overall and differential attrition for the sample inside the same bandwidth used for the impact analysis, with or without adjusting for the forcing variable. For example, if researchers used a bandwidth of 30 points around the cutoff to estimate the intervention impact, they would use the same bandwidth of 30 points around the cutoff to estimate overall and differential attrition. Although the researchers need not adjust for the forcing variable using this approach, other than applying the bandwidth, the value of the forcing variable must be known for all units so that the bandwidth can be applied. Recall that completely satisfying the RDD Standard 2 requires that the study satisfy RDD Criterion 2A by establishing low attrition using one of the two approaches just described, both of which have the potential to adjust most accurately for the forcing variable. However, if a study does not use one of those two previous approaches, an RDD study still can satisfy RDD Criterion 2B by using another approach that may not provide as accurate an adjustment for the forcing variable. Specifically, researchers can calculate overall and differential attrition for the entire research sample, with or without adjusting for the forcing variable. If authors calculate attrition both with and without adjusting for the forcing variable, the WWC will review both and assign the highest possible rating to this part of the study design. However, only one of the two approaches may be used to calculate overall and differential attrition. For example, if the overall attrition rate is calculated using an approach that does adjust for the forcing variable, then the differential attrition rate also must be calculated using the approach that adjusts for the forcing variable. There are many scenarios where RDD findings do not satisfy either RDD Criterion 2A or 2B because the findings have high or unknown attrition. As with randomized controlled trials, the WWC requirements for satisfying the baseline equivalence criterion, or RDD Criterion 2C, depend on which attrition boundary is used to assess attrition. If the cautious attrition boundary is used to assess attrition, satisfying RDD Criterion 2C requires demonstrating that groups are similar at the cutoff on key baseline covariates specified in the handbook, and applying the appropriate statistical adjustments. For an RDD, estimating baseline group differences involves calculating an impact at the cutoff on the covariate of interest. Study authors must either use the same bandwidth and/or a functional form that was used to estimate the impact on the outcome, or they must use the same algorithm for selecting the bandwidth and/or functional form that was used to estimate the impact on the outcome. The baseline equivalence standard for other group design standards applies to the findings from RDDs. Namely, if the impact for any baseline covariate is less than or equal to 0.05 standard deviations, then no adjustment is required. If the impact for a covariate is between 0.05 and 0.25 standard deviations, then the statistical model used to estimate the average intervention effect on the outcome must include a statistical adjustment for that covariate to satisfy this criterion. If the impact is greater than 0.25 standard deviations in absolute value, RDD Criterion 2C is not satisfied because baseline equivalence has not been established. For dichotomous outcomes in RDDs, authors must provide the predicted mean covariate value at the cutoff, estimated using data from below the cutoff, and the predicted probability at the cutoff, estimated using data from above the cutoff. Both predicted probabilities must be calculated using the same statistical model that is used to estimate the impact of the covariate at the cutoff. These predicted probabilities are needed so that WWC reviewers can transform the impact estimate into standard deviation units. This analysis must be conducted using only subjects with non-missing values of the key outcome variable used in this study. When assessing baseline equivalence in RDDs, study authors may exclude sample members from the analysis for reasons that are clearly exogenous to intervention participation. For example, authors may calculate baseline equivalence using only data within the bandwidth that was used to estimate the impact on the outcome. Again, the burden of proof falls on the study authors to demonstrate that any sample exclusions were made for exogenous reasons. Finally, as with randomized controlled trials, if the optimistic attrition boundary is used to assess attrition in an RDD, then study authors simply need to use an appropriate statistical adjustment for the key covariates specified in the handbook. This will typically involve inclusion of the covariates as predictors in the model or models used to estimate the impact at the forcing variable. Again, study authors need not demonstrate baseline equivalence for groups when the optimistic attrition boundary is used. Time for your first knowledge check in this module. An RDD study examined the impact of a peer mentoring program on undergraduate students' college performance. Students were assigned to receive the intervention based on their scores on an end-of-year mathematics standardized test. Those scoring below 65% were assigned to receive the peer mentoring program, and those scoring at or above 65% received no unique services. Intervention impacts were estimated using a bandwidth of 10 around the cutoff. The authors reported predicted mean attrition rates at the cutoff for the intervention and comparison groups using linear regressions that controlled for the forcing variable and used a bandwidth of 20 around the cutoff. The predicted mean attrition rate for the intervention group was 7%, and the predicted mean attrition rate for the comparison group was 11%. The review team used the cautious attrition boundary to assess attrition. No other information is provided relevant to attrition or baseline equivalence. Based on this information, would the findings from the study satisfy RDD Criterion 2A? In other words, is the combination of overall and differential attrition rates low, using an approach that has the potential to adjust most accurately for the forcing variable? Your choices are A, yes, or B, no. You may want to pause the video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is B. Based on the information provided, this study does not satisfy RDD Criterion 2A. To satisfy RDD Criterion 2A, the study would have to use one of the two acceptable approaches for accurately adjusting for the forcing variable. Although the authors reported predicted mean attrition rates at the cutoff, they used a different bandwidth in the impact estimation and attrition models. The authors also provided no information indicating that they selected the bandwidths using the same bandwidth selection algorithm. Thus, based on the information provided, this study does not satisfy the RDD Criterion 2A. Knowledge check 2. In an RDD study examining the impact of a gifted or high achiever tracking program, a total of 500 students were eligible for assignment. 100 students were assigned to the intervention condition, and 400 were assigned to the comparison condition. Intervention impacts were estimated using a bandwidth of 25. Within the bandwidth used for impact estimation, there were 75 students assigned to the intervention condition and 200 to the comparison condition. Of those students within the bandwidth, the authors successfully collected outcome data for 71 intervention participants and 193 comparison group participants. For RDD Standard 2, what is the highest rating a finding from this study could achieve? Your choices are A. Completely satisfy the standard, B. Partially satisfy the standard, or C. Does not satisfy the standard. You may want to pause the video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Based on the information provided, this study would completely satisfy the attrition and baseline equivalence standard. Overall and differential attrition can be calculated for the sample inside the bandwidth used for impact estimation, and attrition is low. Overall attrition is 4% and differential attrition is 2%. Because the reported combination of overall and differential attrition rates is low, using an approach that has the most potential to adjust accurately for the forcing variable, the study satisfies RDD Criterion 2A and therefore completely satisfies the attrition and baseline equivalence standard. Knowledge Check 3. In an RDD study examining the impact of science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, learning community effects on college students' mathematics achievement, a total of 903 students were eligible for assignment. 388 students were assigned to the intervention condition, and 515 were assigned to the comparison condition. Intervention impacts were estimated using a bandwidth of 60 on a college entrance exam cutoff score. Analytic sample sizes were not reported within the bandwidth. However, among the full sample of students, the authors reported collecting mathematics achievement outcome data for 279 intervention participants and 361 comparison group participants. For RDD Standard 2, what is the highest rating a finding from this study could achieve? Your choices are A. Completely satisfy the standard, B. Partially satisfy the standard, or C. Does not satisfy the standard. You may want to pause the video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is B. Based on the information provided, this study would partially satisfy the attrition and baseline equivalence standard because it satisfies RDD Criterion 2B by establishing low attrition using an acceptable method. Overall and differential attrition can be calculated for the entire research sample without adjusting for the forcing variable, and attrition is low. Overall attrition is 29% and differential attrition is 2%. Because the reported combination of overall and differential attrition rates is low, using an approach that may not provide as accurate an adjustment for the forcing variable, the study findings partially can satisfy the attrition and baseline equivalence standard. Cluster level assignment RDDs can meet RDD Standard 2 in one of three ways, just like individual level assignment RDDs. To completely satisfy RDD Standard 2, the finding must satisfy Criterion 2A by demonstrating low attrition at the cluster level, limiting the risk of bias due to joiners, and demonstrating low attrition at the individual level using an appropriate reference sample as described in the group design training. Both attrition calculations must use an approach that has the potential to accurately adjust for the forcing variable. There are two options for partially satisfying Standard 2. The first option is to satisfy Criterion 2b. Just like Criterion 2a, the finding must demonstrate low attrition at the cluster level, limit the risk of bias due to joiners, and demonstrate low attrition at the individual level using an appropriate reference sample. The only difference is that one or both attrition calculations also may use a method that has the potential to adjust less accurately for the forcing variable. The second option for satisfying Standard 2 is to satisfy Criterion 2c. Recall that Criterion 2c is the baseline equivalence criterion, the highest possible rating that a study can receive if it partially satisfies Standard 2 meets WWC standards with reservations. So cluster assignment RDDs may satisfy the baseline equivalence requirement at the individual level or the cluster level. If attrition is high or unknown under the optimistic boundary, cluster assignment RDDs may meet this requirement via adjustment. If attrition is high or unknown under the cautious boundary, the studies must demonstrate baseline equivalence of the individuals or the clusters. Cluster assignment studies also must meet all of the special considerations for cluster assignment group designs as outlined in Chapter 3, Step 4, Baseline Equivalence. Recall that some RDDs may report pooled impacts for some combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples. Remember that pooled impacts are defined as those based on data from each combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample that are standardized and grouped into a single data set for which a single impact is calculated. For example, if a study was conducted at 5 separate sites, study authors might report pooled impacts if they standardized and combined the data from all 5 sites into a single data set, and then estimated a single intervention impact estimate using that data set. In the case of a pooled impact, RDD standards 2A and 2B, as we have just described, can be applied directly if the authors calculate and report overall and differential attrition using the pooled sample. Any sample excluded from calculating the pooled impact for reasons of endogeneity, such as a lack of consent or issues with intervention implementation, cannot be excluded from attrition calculation. RDD Criterion 2c can also be applied directly as previously described. Recall that other RDDs may report aggregate impacts for some combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples. Remember that aggregate impacts are defined as those that are calculated as weighted averages of impacts calculated separately for every combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample. For example, if a study were conducted at 5 separate sites, study authors might report aggregate impacts if they estimated intervention impacts separately for each of those 5 sites and then combined those 5 impact estimates together into a weighted average. In the case of an aggregate impact, RDD standard 2A and 2B can be applied to the overall and differential attrition rates calculated as weighted averages of the attrition rates calculated for each unique combination of values that contribute to the aggregate impact. Authors must calculate overall and differential attrition for each of those unique combinations in a way that is consistent with the RDD standard 2, and the weights used in aggregation must be the same weights used to calculate the weighted impact being reviewed by the WWC. The attrition standard is then applied to the combination of overall and differential attrition based on the weighted average. RDD Criterion 2C can also be applied directly, as previously described. This concludes our module on the WWC's attrition and baseline equivalence standard. Let's review what we discussed in this module. We described the 3 criteria used to assess the RDD attrition and baseline equivalence standard, or RDD standard 2. To completely satisfy the standard, findings must satisfy criterion 2A by reporting low attrition using one of the acceptable approaches that will adjust most accurately for the forcing variable. To partially satisfy the attrition and baseline equivalence standard, a finding must satisfy criterion 2B by reporting low attrition, using an approach that may not provide as accurate an adjustment for the forcing variables, or it must satisfy criterion 2C by establishing baseline equivalence on key covariates. And finally, any findings that do not satisfy 2A, 2B, or 2C will not satisfy the RDD standard 2. Recall that there are 5 total standards that determine an RDD study findings research rating. You are now familiar with 2 of the 5 standards. The next module in the training series will focus on the 3rd standard, which relates to the continuity in the relationship between the outcome and forcing variable in RDD studies.